So if it's not obvious, then this video will be the start of a new series, I would say, about cities, countries and populations within them countries in modern times, and basically differences, contrasting between different cities and different countries, looking at the differences between them, the layout, the way there is critical infrastructure within nations as well. And in this one, obviously, we're looking at America and Europe and the US basically in contention with European cities and the difference between them in such as why America, or the US I should probably say, as it's a more apt description, uh, has skyscrapers, more skyscrapers, in contrast to places like France, Russia, Britain, Ireland, Germany, so on and so forth. So why? Why are there more skyscrapers in America in contrast to Europe? Well, I guess one thing would be age, the age of the cities, in contrast to America, where the cities have only been around for, say, a few hundred years, three, four, 500, maybe at tops. European cities have been around for a lot longer, and they make American cities seem virtually new in comparison to the archaic designs that can be found within these cities in Europe. A good example, of course, is Rome or Athens, and this doesn't really account for a lot per se, because obviously you have what's it called? You can expand outside of the cities and build skyscrapers further out from the older parts. But obviously, this explains for why there isn't as many, say, well, skyscrapers within the centre of the cities, as these are usually the oldest parts of the cities. So this is usually where a lot of the older buildings are found, and this is why skyscrapers are less common usually in these places. Though then again, a lot of buildings do get knocked down, and you do see a lot of skyscrapers get put up in their places, especially in Europe, where in contrast to America, a lot of the cities are much newer, a lot of the buildings are less important, and a lot of the buildings, especially in New York, where there was a mass drive to build skyscrapers as it showed power, it showed wealth. Now, of course, Washington DC is a slight change in all of the US cities where it has a build limit that is set quite small in contrast with the cities in the US, but also it's the outlier within it all. There is also like the UK has certain building parameters, especially when it comes to viewing of certain buildings. And I remember this, and I have to look into this a bit more probably, but there is a certain thing where certain buildings have to be seeable from certain other buildings within the city, so they have to be in eyesight, and the ability to see them from wherever they are is necessary, meaning that buildings cannot obstruct the view from these buildings. So you can't build a skyscraper, say, that obstructs the view from the I don't know, the Tower of London to a certain other building within London. And this obviously means that less skyscrapers can be built around these areas. Alongside that, a lot of old buildings, like in Rome with the Colosseum and stuff, mean that building stuff there isn't really a thing that you can do, especially since a lot of the buildings in Rome built on hills and stuff. But skyscrapers do get built. Now, a reason why a lot of countries in Europe are hesitant to build skyscrapers is they might not look good. London has a good example of this with one of its buildings that slightly slants to the side, which is absolutely atrocious looking design. But it's there, it exists, and we put up with it. But it's an example of why certain buildings don't fit in. That's also down to bad design. But skyscrapers in general, in an old fashioned looking city, just don't fit in as much. Now, there has been a large growth in skyscrapers within Europe, many more are being built. But capital cities, especially, see a little less in comparison to some other cities. But they still build them. They still build quite a few of them. But why Europe has all these old buildings still around? Why after World War II? They were a lot of old buildings, especially in mainland continental Europe, were pretty much flattened destroyed, gone, yeah? But instead of building new modern style skyscrapers and new modern buildings, they decided to go with their old traditional buildings, rebuild what was destroyed so the cities had some form of semblance uh, and tradition to them. And this is in stark contrast again with America, uh, who didn't go through any kind of that conflict at the time. So it meant that even though it was already building skyscrapers, if it wasn't, and it had the opportunity to replace older buildings with newer buildings, it couldn't because it didn't go through that. It didn't have any mainland ground bombardment by enemy planes or ground forces like, say, France, Poland, or even Russia did. But the Europeans decided, instead of making skyscrapers, they decided to stick with their more older traditional buildings, and it's not until later on that they started making more modern style skyscraper based buildings, and laws were set in place that meant that these kind of buildings, after a few little mistakes where they were built near more traditional style buildings, could only be built in certain places throughout cities in Europe. Uh, I believe this is a good example of why buildings are not really skyscrapers are not really built in Europe, in contrast to like America or the USA, I should say. You know what I mean when I say America, I mean the USA. Uh, it's mainly because there's not really a need to either. I mean, style, yes, and the way it looks, yes, of course, but there's also not that big of a need to at the moment. A lot of the buildings that have already been built are up to the standard of which businesses and companies can run out of them. Uh, but you never know. Later in the future, there may be even more of a demand and more of a need. Right now, there isn't too much of a demand and too much of a need. But all things change, especially when it comes to living. I mean, we can technically call apartment buildings and stuff skyscrapers as they are. And when it comes to living within Europe, European cities are much more flatter and spread out due to the fact that, they are not all as big as like cities in New York and stuff. London is comparable to it, but they don't really build as many skyscrapers and apartments, though they do have quite a lot. But they're much more compact in New York because of how many skyscrapers you have and how many apartments people can live in. But yeah, no, another video for another day talking about smaller housing, especially more rural-based housing and stuff like that. Should be something that I will talk about in the future. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, it's a new style of video for me and part of a new series that I want to do, talking about infrastructure and different nations and different countries and stuff like that. Anyway, if you enjoyed, subscribe. If you have any other reasons why skyscrapers in Europe are not as common as in America, or the USA, as I should say, then please do leave a comment. If you did enjoy, subscribe, leave a like. You know what I'd ask everybody else asks it of you on this website. And bye.